And yeah. So welcome today to Lisbeth. Lisbeth Lundahl's Professor of Educational Work at Umea University in Sweden. And her research mainly concerns education policy plus young people's trajectories and transitions. And then she's joined today with by Linda Rönnberg, who's a long-standing Network 23 convener, also professor of in the Department of Applied Educational Science at Umea, and that's Pia Seppänen, who's professor in the Department of Education at the University of Turku in Finland. So welcome to all of you, and over to you, Lisbeth.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. It's very nice to join you in this seminar, which we have called Sedimentation and or re-politicization of a highly marketized education system. And we use Sweden as the example for this seminar. And let me see. Sometimes, but well, I have to switch because sometimes it does not work. Well, I will make another try here. No, all of a sudden. Part of this presentation is based on research in the international HOPES research project led by Professor Pia Seppänen, University of Turku. And we, as you said, Pete, we have Pia here today, and we also have two other team members, doctoral students, Ida Kiesi and Nina Nivanaho, also at University of Turku. And they will make some comments at the end of this presentation. And the structure of the seminar is, this is a bit difficult because I cannot, let me see here. I should be able to. John, do you have also access to this presentation? Or because it seems like I have problems moving the pictures. This is the structure of the seminar. After a brief presentation, the points of departure, the main part is devoted to the marketization of education, the Swedish way. How the market situation emerged and developed, what kind of support it got, the resistance or lack of resistance it met, and the present situation. And there comes the questions. Do we see a routinization or a possible questioning and repositioning? We end with our conclusions and reflections on these questions, and we have some comments, as I said, from our Finnish colleagues. And of course, if they want to comment before that, they are very welcome to do so. Finally, we have a discussion with the audience, if you'd like to. Now comes the interesting point. Yes, points of departure, yes. Well, it's no news to you that education has been tied closer to the economy at all levels for the last 30, 40 years. And we now have extensive knowledge of how education has increasingly been redefined as a private rather than a common good, and how it has become subject to marketization and commercialization. And today, education not only has a central function of producing employable and flexible manpower, which is essential for successful competition and economic growth, according to the discourse, but it has also become a profitable market in itself. And again, we have extensive research and knowledge about the harmful effects of this massive economic penetration of education in terms of increased social segregation, reduced influence, democratic influence over education, impoverishment of curricula, etc. It is less common, I would say, to analyze and discuss what would enable a development in the reverse direction. And hopefully, maybe we could start such an analysis and discussion here today. So Sweden will serve as an example of a very far-reaching state-supported privatization and marketization of education that has become institutionalized within a very short period of time, in particular in the 2000s. So if you look at, for instance, education at a glance, it looks like all Sweden is in the top of having public education. But if you scrutinize, statistics, you can see that to a very high extent, these public money are transferred to the private sector and increasingly to for-profit school companies. We depart from cultural political economy or CP theory in line with Bob Jessup, which is a framework that acknowledges the necessity to treat the cultural and the social as dialectically related, and that meaning making and relating or resulting discourses can't be understood isolated from aspects of the social and natural world outside of semiotics. And especially we focus on the phenomena of sedimentation and re-politicization. Sedimentation, says Bob Jessup, covers all forms of routinization that lead, inter alia, to forgetting the contested origins of discourses, practices, processes, and structures. This gives them a form of objective facts of life, especially in the social world. In turn, politicization covers challenges to such objectivation that aim to denaturalize the semiotic and material or extra semiotic features of what has become sedimented. And the question related to the Swedish case is, are we presently mainly seeing a continuing sedimentation or normalization of the state-supported marketization of education? Or do we perhaps witness a re-politicization? More general, is it possible to change the strong market features of education once they have reached a certain level? Or is there a point of no return? Some words about the Swedish case in the rear view mirror. Before the 90s, Sweden had a system of very strong and detailed state governing of education and almost no private schools. But in the early 90s, two important sets of reforms were decided and realized. And they firstly meant a shift to a highly decentralized education system, and secondly, to a fully state-supported, choice, market-oriented system. The decentralization reforms were mainly initiated by social democratic governments. They started already, it was a process started in the 70s. And these reforms both aimed at increased local democracy and higher goal attainment. But it was a right-wing liberal coalition government that proposed and implemented the market reforms, freedom of choice reforms in office 91 to 94. And those reforms aimed at raising the quality and efficiency of education in terms of outcomes, costs, but also at a higher level of innovation of education. The same arguments that we have seen in most countries. But contrary to many other countries, the school choice reforms were carried through in a great hurry without any prior investigations and experiments, in spite of actually OECD experts advising the Swedish government to make such investigations, look at other countries, and have experiments. We don't need that, they said. There's no need of that. Well, they were wrong. The reforms meant that school choice, vouchers, schools competing over students, and privatization of education in the form of tax-funded so-called free schools were combined and added with a large spoonful of business making, and we will come back to that. And it's important to note that all schools, public and private, were supposed to compete with each other over students and vouchers. So it's a full-fledged competition situation. Important to note is that in 1995, under a period of social democratic government, the tuition fees were prohibited, and in return, funding of the vouchers were funded to 100% by tax money. This decision was based on arguments of justice. No one would have to refrain from choosing school because the parents or the family did not have the money. But precisely the same decision meant that far more money was transferred to the free schools, and this was the real beginning of the big companies and capital entering education. I will show you a picture of, just to give you a view of the very rapid development over time. We started with almost no private schools. Today, if we look at all Sweden, around 15% of all students in compulsory schools go to a free school, that is a private school. And twice as many, or rather twice the level, almost 30% of the upper secondary school students go to a free school. However, if we look at Stockholm, you can double these figures. So I would say that around 30% go to of the students go to a private compulsory school, and almost 60% of all upper secondary students in Stockholm region go to a private school. And this has happened within a very short time. Linda, I will ask you to comment this slide.
Mm-hmm. Let's take a look at the flow of public funding to private education companies. This is kind of the other way around from what Lisbeth showed. First of all, we can see that this has turned into quite a substantial market, a massive increase in the last decade. Second of all, the public funds, the tax money, are increasingly going to for-profits in the dark blue bars. They are the winners. They are significantly dominating. They are outcompeting the non-profits in the light blue bars. And the same pattern also holds for the consecutive years from 16 to 19, even a bit amplified. So the tendency that we see here clearly stayed on and stayed on. So for-profits are receiving increasing shares of public tax funding. This is a sign of, first, their increasing embeddedness in the school system, but it's also, secondly, a sign, of course, that the municipalities are increasingly depending on private actors to deliver education services. And finally, just to underline what Lisbeth just said, this has been quite a rapid transformation too. So back to you, Lisbeth.
So, how does the education business sector work, and what is the role of the state in this respect? Well, it has been said many times before, it has been a talk about the competition state, and this is really true in the Swedish case as well. The state promotes and upholds the system of school choice and competition and marketization, business making, by firstly giving far-reaching autonomy to the local providers of education. And there are individual vouchers that follow the student, which means, as I said, all schools have to compete with each other over the students, that is, resources. As soon as one student disappears, you have the sum of money less to work with, but the classes still exist. That is the interesting thing. I mean, the voucher follows this single student, but that's not how we work normally in schools. We work with groups and classes. There are still very liberal rules for the establishment and running of free schools, even if there have been some restrictions. And it's the National Schools Inspectorate that decides on establishing and expanding of free schools. And the municipalities, they have no veto. They are heard, but they cannot decide to stop an establishment, even if they think there are enough schools in the municipality. And free schools are 100% tax funded. The price mechanism is regulated by the state, but the money is transferred from the municipalities to the private providers. And importantly, the Swedish legislation, unlike almost all other countries, has not put up any barriers against owners' profit making. There are no limits to profit making, and you don't have to reinvest profits in schools or education. If we look at the formidable industry, Swedish education industry today, well, as I said, the reforms of the 90s opened up for a for-profit educational industry. And you could say that, and as I said, especially this decision on 100% tax funding meant that Swedish education became very attractive both for national and international business, including venture capitalists that started to see free schools as attractive and low-risk investment opportunities with promising profits. And currently, the free schools have a lot of providers, different providers, but as you can see, the large majority, 3/4 of all free school students at preschool, compulsory, upper secondary school level go to schools run by limited companies, and the figure is highest in upper secondary education. Yes, I think I will give the word to Linda.
Yes, and we will look at support and resistance over time. And first of all, it is clear when we look back that there are indeed important and influential networks or advocacy coalitions, to speak with Paul Sabatier, including financial and business actors and their related associations and interest groups that have all been supporting and promoting this development. But these are also, second of all, successfully linked to political parties. And overall, it's only the left party that has argued strongly against private providers in education. The issue of profit making is a bit more complex, and the party positions have changed in interesting ways, but maybe this is not the time to go into these. But for now, let's note the overall stable political support. Still, politics is, as they say, a business where the currency is trust. And scandals around the 2010s, including school bankruptcies, and also we need to mention, of course, the Swedish PISA decline, it generally created a stir and it affected how education policy was discussed politically. However, there have been no substantial changes on limiting privatization that have been passed through Parliament. And this is largely a result of political majorities, how they have been formed, and sometimes also quite volatile and changing party positions in particular issues, for instance, the for-profit issue. The policy position by the teacher unions are quite interesting too, and we would say, need even more scholarly attention too. But in brief, the two large teacher unions have overall been supporting the process of privatization. Still, and in more recent times, and we will get into this into more detail a bit later on, arguments for change have increasingly been voiced, both from the teacher unions and from other domains in the public debate. But before we go into that, I think we should look at the political and parliamentary arena. And that is when I will ask Lisbeth to please change the slide. Thank you. Very briefly here, a position to the right represents a positive opinion to allowing profit making in public welfare, and a position to the left implies a negative view. The upper line shows the preferences by the members of parliament in the Riksdag in 2014, and the lower line is the opinion of the electorate in 2016. And in short, the straighter the line, the more correspondence, the more similarity between the opinion of the voters and their elected representatives. But as we can see, there's a significant discrepancy here on the right. The MPs from the three parties, the moderates, the Centre Party, and the Christian Democrats, they are more positive to allow profit making than their voters. On this particular issue, they are not representing the preferences of their voters very well at all. In fact, it is quite a remarkable cleavage. The difference has been described by Lennart Nilsson, who made this diagram, as both surprising and extreme, given the generally very high levels of congruence that are normally found in this kind of data when measuring other issues. So this is kind of an issue that goes against the general pattern, and it's both relevant and important to think about this and why, and to keep this in mind as we now start to move into more of the current situation. And then I think I will ask Lisbeth once again to change the slide, please. Thank you. We're moving into the current situation. We may also say that, yes. So,
yeah. So
I think I will continue to say a few words about the data. To aid us in the quest of trying to closing in on the question of the future, we now turn to the interview data that we collected in the HOPES project that was previously mentioned. And a total of 18 informants were interviewed, all but one made pre-COVID. That needs to be made explicit in these times. The sample includes both contextual policy actors representing influential organized interests, as well as private businesses that are delivering education or selling or delivering services and products to schools and municipalities. And it may also be worth mentioning that some of these informants from companies, and here there were mostly CEOs that were interviewed, they also, and in addition, were active in different business associations like teaching materials, but also representing the non-profit free school organized interests. The interviewees were, among other things, asked about how they envision the role of private actors 10 years into the future. And what did they say? Let's change the slide, please. A strong and dominant narrative is in the upper left, and that is the narrative that there will be no turning back. As private actors now are deeply ingrained, they are embedded in the system to the very extent that it would be hard, if not at all impossible, to educate the future generation if private actors would not be there. For instance, if profit regulations changed. None of the interviewed foresaw any major changes or critical junctures that would overall alter or challenge the policy path dependency visible here. Related to this, and second of all, in the lower left, there is a removal of public-private boundaries. The recognition that the public and the private are in fact irrelevant categories as long as high-quality education is maintained. Instead, all actors, both public and private, face the same future challenges. And here there are particularly two problem articulations that stand out in the material and the narratives. It is firstly the lack of qualified teachers, the teacher shortage, and second of all, the challenge of digitalization. And please remember also that this was all pre-COVID, and the private actors in particular tended to connect to this overall narrative of the future. Moving to the upper right, the future will contain some adjustments, and the need for regulatory change is voiced more or less across the board, even if the primary points on exactly what rules that are needed to be changed differ a bit between the actors. One such point is school choice design and how school queues are to be regulated and by who. Another is on the revised voucher levels, the amount of the voucher, and another on the municipal procedures for issuing permits for buildings for free schools that can either hinder or hamper their local settlement. Even though municipalities do not hold a veto, they have some other leverage that they can use. But notably, none of these rules are primarily challenging the game as such. They are adjusting the rules of the game.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, then in the lower right, and primarily now from the business side, we have a vision of the future as there will be continued private actor consolidation in education delivery. In a maturing and consolidating market, there's also an ownership concentration when a few dominant actors are getting larger and larger by acquiring the smaller ones. And this is already a feature of the Swedish education industry, but also articulated as a trait and a development for the future from parts of the interview data.
Mm.
But then is this to be challenged or not? We need to move on to Lisbeth now and take a look at the newspapers.
Yes, and a partly different picture emerges, not totally different, but a bit surprisingly, or not, a number of rather critical articles has entered the daily press. And this little sub-study is based on a search for articles in the 8 largest daily newspapers, 2019 to 21, to March 21. And it is newspapers that cover either the whole Sweden or in some cases the big city areas. And the search terms were free schools and profits. It was a very simple search, but still interesting. And I will start with this picture. It's a cover page of the Sydsvenska Dagbladet, which is a big daily newspaper in the south of Sweden. And it's like almost all daily newspapers in Sweden has a liberal/conservative orientation. And this is the cover page. That's how school became a profit machine. Sweden is the only country in the world where private schools are fully tax funded and where the owners of the schools are allowed to extract profits without limitations. How did this happen? And then there are 5 pages, I think, an article with interviews and a very well researched text. I wrote to the journalist and said that I really thought it was a very good article. And what is new, I think, is that both editorials, a number of editorials in these newspapers that are, as I said, conservative, liberal dominated, and also in particular, the leaders of the youth organizations of the conservative liberal parties have started to criticize different aspects of this business making in education. So I have some quotations here, and they are tough. They talk about, considering that these are influential actors on the same side as they are, these editorials talk about their own politicians sitting in the laps of the big school companies, forgetting about students and education, focusing business interest. And similarly, they talk about cunning school companies handing out laptops instead of employing teachers, vulgar marketing from school companies that are more interested in profits than in education. So it's no nice articles. I mean, if you look, I mean, it's a rather harsh tone. And if we go to the young generation of right-wing liberal politicians. Here we have 4 quotations, 2 from the Moderate Youth League, that is the Conservative Youth League. The chair says, I argue that many leading non-socialist politicians have run the school companies' errands instead of promoting the education system to become as well functioning as possible. And if you look at, well, you can read yourself. I mean, it's again, tough critics. But the interesting thing is, none of these voices advocate a shift. And this quotation from the chair of the Centre Party Youth Organization, which is the most, I mean, the party is the most liberal, but also the most, the strongest defender of business making and the present system. But she says, the free school reform is the baby of the older generation. We, the younger ones, love freedom of choice and competition, but recognize that there are weaknesses. So what they fear, all these critics, none of them advocate a return to the old order, but they are afraid that the negative sides of this market system will be the enemy of the system. They want to defend the system by criticizing and analyzing the negative sides. Some comments and reflections. And I think what I would like to say with this picture is that, as Jessup says, there is a co-evolution of semiotic and extra-semiotic processes. It's both about politicization and sedimentation. It's both about discourses and the material, if you say. And the thing is that it's not like we go from one to the other. All aspects are still there. So if we look at the late 1970s, when Sweden underwent a marked discursive turn, you could say, driven from industry and the political right. But also parts of the social democratic leadership embraced it. The obsolete, inflexible mode of central governing, the need for deregulation and modernization, increased freedom of choice, and the firm as a model for efficiency, quality, and innovation. That was the discourse that we recognize from most other countries. So this strong discourse that went on and was strengthened in the 80s resulted in also a comeback of the conservative liberal government that was for some years in office in the 70s, but now they came back in the beginning of the 90s. And what they did was to start a process of sedimentation. The discourse made it possible to introduce a new legislation, a new rules, especially regarding funding. I mean, the economic steering is always the most powerful. So this really changed the material preconditions, and we saw, I mean, you could see that these reforms of decentralization, marketization allowed for a thorough restructuring, but it was a silent revolution at the same time. There were no demonstrations or other public manifestations. And this was a change that was further developed, as I told before, by administrative means, new rules for tax funding of free schools. And all of a sudden, a brand new business branch had developed. And most Swedes did not really realize what had happened. And a new normal started to exist, a new everyday life, if you like. If we then go to the 2020s, there is a possible re-politicization. We have this emerging discourse, the new old. the old I mean, now it is the ones who were modern and new in the 80s and early 90s are now the old ones in need of critique because things are going wrong. But at the same time, and as I said, there are fears that the negative sides of school business will ruin the system. So there is no, but importantly, at the same time, we see also a beginning mobilization of professionals and public calls in social media and otherwise, debate articles in these newspapers I told you about. And they are related to several things, including discontent with certain private schools that I mean, start to demand more money than they should have, which will hurt the public economy even more, segregation, and so on and so forth. I won't go into the detail, but my point is that still the discourses of the 80s and 90s, they still exist. I would say that the supremacy of the market and the virtues of competition and choice, presupposing all kinds of providers, even limited companies, they prevail to large extent. And add to that a new material reality, the sheer extent of students, teachers, schools, houses. I mean, just think of it. So the advocates of the present school market system, they can point at a huge number of students who would have to change schools, teachers and other staff that would lose their present jobs, etc. And that is a very effective threat, which they have used already in the 2010s. So the question is there a point of return? Have we reached the point of no return or not? And before discussing this, I would like to ask Pia Seppinen and colleagues, to Ida and Nina, to make some comments. And I think, Pete, you have the slide.
Yes.
Or that Pia can share. You can share your slide. Yes, fine.
Yes. If you stop the sharing, then I can share then.
Yeah. So I will take away this. Yeah. Let me see now, so I can. I have some problems with my now. Yeah.
Thank you, Lisbeth, and thank you for asking some comments, and we are happy to see. So we are very pleased to comment reflections from Finland to this Swedish edu business presentation. I'm Pia Seppinen, and then we have here Sonja Lempinen and Ida Kiesi and Nina Nivanaho. So we are a group of 4 at the University of Turku. That's by the River Aura. Sorry to be a little bit of a commercial here. We are in the same project that identifies who are the private actors in schooling in these countries and analyze how they operate. So we have like three short comments. I will use only a couple of minutes. And the first one is very simple in a perspective of Finland. You talked a lot about the private actors in providing education due to school choice. In Finland, we had this school choice reform in 1990s, but it was without any private schooling. So all are publicly run by municipalities. And that's why, indeed, as Lisbeth said, Sweden is a mirror for Finland. We really talk Sweden and the public discourses as a warning example of privatization. Then who are the private actors then? So I want to point out there are many various private actors or edu business actors since let's say to mid 2010 we've identified, and how they operate. They use public compulsory comprehensive schooling system as a way to scale and develop their products. for global education industry. So there's a very strong, this called learning technology or education technology business in Finland that is developing. And what's interesting is how they argue that they are needed in the field. So as Lisbeth said, this there will be no turning back, or Linda presented this kind of narrative. So the similar ones are from Finland, that there's no turning back of school without any edu businesses on technology. What's interesting here, how they act and how they use discourses of change, help and update the old-fashioned school. This is what we've seen once interviewed these actors, and how they do this industry making with actually state actors. So the state actors are very active in creating these kind of education ecosystems, or co-development as they call it. So what was astonishing is that state actors want education be similar industry as, let's say, Nokia or forest industry previously. So this is how this reconstructing of public education takes place in a Finnish context, and we are very interested to open up the conversations here today to have questions, and all of the Finnish group is also willing to answer any possible questions or impossible questions. Thank you.